The herbicide of Palestine. The confidence the Jewish command in early April had in their capacity not only to take over but also to cleanse the areas the UN had granted to the Jewish state can be gauged from the way immediately after Operation Nachshon they turned their attention to the major urban centers of Palestine. These were systematically attacked throughout the rest of the month, as UN agents and British officials stood by and watched indifferently. The offensive against the urban centers began with Tiberias. As soon as news of Deir Yassin and the massacre 3 days later, 12 April, in the nearby village of Hirbat Nasr al Din, reached the large Palestinian population in the city, many fled. The people were also petrified by the daily heavy bombardments by the Jewish forces situated in the hills overlooking this historic ancient capital on the Sea of Galilee, where 6,000 Jews and 5,000 Arabs and their forebears had for centuries coexisted peacefully. British obstruction meant that the ALA had only managed to supply the city with a force of about 30 volunteers. These were no match for the Haganah forces, who rolled barrel bombs down from the hills and used loudspeakers to broadcast terrifying noises to frighten the population, an early version of the supersonic flights over Beirut in 1983 and Gaza in 2005, which human rights organizations have decried as criminal acts. Tiberias fell on 18 April. The British played a questionable role in the attack on Tiberias. At first, they offered to protect the Palestinian residents, but soon urged them to negotiate a general evacuation of the town with the Jewish forces. King Abdullah of Jordan was more practical. He sent 30 trucks to help move women and children. In his memoirs, he claimed he was convinced another Deir Yassin was about to occur. British officers later professed to having had similar apprehensions, but documents showing heavy British pressure on the community's leaders to leave do not reveal any great concern about an impending massacre. Some would say that the British thereby prevented Tiberias's Arab residents from being massacred. Others would argue that they collaborated with the expellers. The role of the British is much clearer and far more negative in the next chapters of Palestine's herbicide, when Haifa and Jaffa were occupied. The de Arabization of Haifa. As mentioned previously, operations in Haifa were retroactively approved and welcomed by the consultancy, although not necessarily initiated by it. The early terrorization of the city's Arab population the previous December had prompted many among the Palestinian elite to leave for their residencies in Lebanon and Egypt until calm returned to their city. It is hard to estimate how many fell within this category. Most historians put the figure at around 15 to 20,000. On 12 January 1948, a local leader called Farid Saad, the manager of the Arab Bank in Haifa, and a member of the local national committee, telegraphed Dr. Hussein Khalidi, the secretary of the Arab Higher Committee, in despair. It is good the Jews do not know the truth. The truth was that the urban elite in Palestine had collapsed after a month of heavy Jewish selling and aggression. However, the Jews knew exactly what was going on. Indeed, the consultancy was well aware that the rich and well to do had already left in December, that the Arab arms were not arriving, and the Arab governments did little beyond airing their inflammatory war rhetoric in all directions so as to hide their inaction and unwillingness to intervene on behalf of the Palestinians. The departure of the affluent meant that between 15 and 55 and 60,000 Palestinians in Haifa were leaderless, and given the relatively small number of armed Arab volunteers in the town at the mercy of the Jewish forces in April 1948. This was despite the presence of British troops in the city, who were theoretically responsible for the locals' safety and well being. This phase of the Jewish operation around the city was given the ominous name of Scissors, Misparayim, indicating both the idea of a pincer movement and of cutting the city off from its Palestinian hinterland. Haifa, like Tiberias, had been allocated in the UN plan to the Jewish state. Leaving the only major port in the country in Jewish control was yet another manifestation of the unfair deal the Palestinians were offered in the UN peace proposal. The Jews wanted the port city, but without the 75 million thousand Palestinians who lived there. And in April 1948, they achieved their objective. As Palestine's main port, Haifa was also the last station on the trail of the British pullout. The British had been expected to stay until August, but in February 1948 they decided to bring the date of departure forward to May. Their troops were consequently present in great numbers and they still had the legal and one could argue moral authority to impose law and order in the city. Their conduct, as many British politicians were later to admit, forms one of the most shameful chapters in the history of the British Empire in the Middle East. The Jewish campaign of terrorization, begun in December, included heavy shelling, sniper fire, rivers of ignited oil and fuel sent down the mountainside, and detonated barrels of explosives, and went on for the first months of 1948, but it intensified in early April. On 18 April, the day the Palestinians of Tiberias were put to flight, Major General Hugh Stockwell, the British commander of the northern sector seated in Haifa, summoned the Jewish authorities in the city to his office and informed them that in 2 days the British forces would be removed from locations in which they had been serving as a buffer zone between the two communities. This buffer was the only obstacle preventing Jewish forces from a direct assault on and takeover of the Palestinian areas where more than 50,000 people still resided. The road was wide open for the de-Arabization of Haifa. This task was given to the Carmeli Brigade, one of the top units of the Jewish army. There were brigades of lesser quality, such as Kiryati, made up of Arab Jews who were sent only on looting or less attractive missions. The definition of Kiryati as possessing a lesser human quality can be found in the Israeli documents. The 2000 Carmeli Brigade troops faced a poorly equipped army of 500 local and mainly Lebanese volunteers who had inferior arms and limited ammunition, and certainly nothing to match the armored cars and mortars on the Jewish side. The removal of the British barrier meant Operation Scissors could be replaced by Operation Cleansing the Leaven, Bi'ur Hamed. The Hebrew term stands for total cleansing and refers to the Jewish religious practice of eliminating all traces of bread or flour from people's homes on the eve of the Passover, since as these are forbidden during the days of feast. Brutally appropriate, the cleansing of Haifa, in which the Palestinians were the bread and the flour, began on Passover's Eve, 21st April.